My name is Monk Rowe for the Phileas Jazz Archive. I'm very pleased to have A.B. Spellman with me today, who is a poet, an essayist, a jazz writer, arts advocate, a teacher, and a man who hitchhiked from D.C. to New York to hear Cecil Taylor play the piano. That takes some commitment.
Not when you're 20 years old. When you're 20 years old, all these things are easy. Let's go to New York. How shall we? Let's hitchhike. You know?
Yeah. What was it about his music that caused you to do that?
Well, power, I think. That was the thing about the new music of the late 50s and 1960s, was that it was so much power in it. And your mind was never at rest when you were hearing it. Your mind was always open and moving and always challenged. And I couldn't get enough of it. I couldn't find that in any other aspect of life.
Was there a setup for you musically, specifically with jazz artists? And when I say setup, I'll share a brief little anecdote of myself that the first John Coltrane record I bought unknowingly was Ohm. And then and that was not a setup.
So you started out on the heavy end, didn't you?
Yes, and it scared me off a little bit. So, but I wonder what set you up to enjoy Cecil Taylor.
What Cecil Taylor? Well, first of all, when I first got into Cecil Taylor, he was not quite the powerhouse he was at the time that he was a few years later. He was still finding his voice, and he was playing in little coffee houses around Greenwich Village, and on some pretty raggedy pianos. And I got to watch him in the late 50s. I got to watch him grow, which is always a wonderful thing to do with another artist, to watch them grow watch them actually in flower themselves. Mm-hmm. And so by the early 60s, you could see the power that I spoke of earlier was there. It was music that what I had never heard before. It was music that didn't exist anywhere else. He was not like anybody else, which is also a very rare thing to find, an artist who is not like another artist. And Cecil wasn't. So I just became thoroughly enthralled with what he was doing. And also I was getting to know him a little bit. And that too is a great situation to have, to know an artist who is in the process of growing.
Did you feel that his personality was reflected in his music that seemed to always be seeking the far boundaries? I may not be speaking exactly on point here, but did he have a personality that reflected the way he played?
He had a conversation that reflected the way he played. His personality was that of one that you would recognize, a very, very, very smart person who had a mind that was flying all over the place as he taught, who was extremely curious about all manner of things and had strong opinions about all manner of things. He used to borrow my records of contemporary composers, of Cage and Warren Feldman and others, Stockhouse, and he would borrow those until I stopped lending them to him because he'd always give them back all scratched up. And he got very angry about that. I don't think he ever forgave me for that. So he was always exploring and always curious. But he was also very, very serious to make certain that he studied the roots as much as he studied the expanse of music. So
Did you hear him with various sidemen? And if so, did you observe anything watching the sidemen that reflected the challenge of playing with Cecil Taylor?
yeah, not everybody could do it, and not just sidemen, also like co-partners. I mean, if you listen to the Mary Lou Williams Cecil Taylor record, they're not always in accord. Um, or the Max Roach one, where they certainly they had no trouble finding a common rhythm, but the question of whose voice would be on top was an issue. Um, but there's great music on both those recordings. There are points at which they did come together brilliantly. But as for the Sidemen, he basically developed musicians. Sonny Murray, for example, who actually is a more important drummer than is generally acknowledged. Sonny, I saw grow through his work with Cecil. You could see it to see his improvement and his it was his sense of finding out what Cecil needed from the drums, which was not propulsion, and Cecil certainly had enough of that, but more of a pattern of what am I looking for? More of an impulse that could just sort of work in concert with the piano. So you can see Jimmy Lyons, for example, a very, very good musician who should be noted more. Jimmy Lyons was able to play a more standard kind of a sound, but would have the rhythmic capability as well as the fluidity not to get stuck from bar line to bar line, but to just flow across it all and to go wherever Cecil took him. At the same time remaining very accessible. So yes, he basically developed people.
You sound like you were or are a musician.
No,
Were
no, no.
you ever did you ever aspire to be one?
I studied voice as an elective in college. I had a very good voice, but no talent for singing. Uh, and, I mean, nobody ever got mad at me for singing, but nobody, I didn't get notes from the ladies at the bar asking me to come over for a drink either. So nobody ever gave me big applause, but it was always polite applause. And that is a fact. But no, I really, I got into poetry by the time I left college, and that's what I decided to pursue.
What part did your love of jazz play in the construction of your poems?
It's a difficult question to answer straight on. The thing is that they're entirely different things. Jazz as stimulus, jazz is a way of keeping that part of the mind that hooks up reason and intuition, which basically is what poetry is. It could work that way as an accompanist. But on the other hand, I can't write to jazz. I cannot. I cannot write a word to jazz. I can write to classical music, but I cannot write to jazz. I can't. Charlie Parker, John Coltrane. I can't write a word.
I just noticed that struck me because I was reading "Dear John Coltrane," your poem, and it says, "At the dead of night, I'm writing poetry in another hotel room, and J.S. Bach is on the radio." And I went back and read that again because the title of, John Coltrane, and you're listening to J.S. Bach. It was a nice juxtaposition.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, it's all music. It's all music. I wouldn't surprise me if Bach were alive today that he'd be a jazz musician. He was a great improviser, after all.
Yeah.
And I think probably that may be how he did most of his compositions. I mean, man, to write that many cantatas can't possibly have been sitting there putting it all down. I think he improvised a lot of music and had people copy it for him as he played. That was a guess I got from a composer of my acquaintance. But at any rate, yeah, I think that there is again that kind of note to note discovery that you hear in the great musicians, you know, where you know that they are finding something every time they write or play a phrase. That is an element of the music that I think is what makes it, which distinguishes the quality of musicians. That there's always something new to them and to us in everything they write.
Do you feel that that might be one reason why jazz is requires more of listeners than most pop music?
Well, yes. First of all, jazz does require that of you. It is always demanded that you be in the music. Some of that has to do with its dance roots, and it's unfortunate. I think that jazz lost its dance roots, as most of the great, as many of the great musics have done. I mean, like Latin music did retain its Latin jazz retained a dance basis, but you lose a lot when you remove that dance element from it. You lose, first of all, a basic way of communicating with the audience, because it's one thing to have the music get you up out of your seat and moving, and another to have you sitting there and concentrating, which is not, which is beyond the capacity of a lot of people. A lot of people really can't sit and be quiet and listen to music and do nothing else, just concentrate and listen for an hour or two without saying a word. Um, so I think that, but the thing is that if you can do that, if you can do that, great music can do so much more for you. You know, it can do a lot for you. It can inspire, it can confirm, it can actually give direction. Um, it can take you places you haven't been. And so, yeah, I think that the question was originally about poetry, was it not?
It was. We
Okay,
we did an improvisation.
okay. I'm trying to be
Well,
Like Art Tatum here, who get way uh, off the harmonic structure of the song and find these elaborate ways to get back to
yes.
it. I'm trying to do that, but I'm not Art Tatum. But at any rate, poetry is almost antithetical to jazz in a way, especially if you write contemplative poetry, as I do. I'm not a performance poet. I mean, I think the poems read well because they're basically conversational, but I don't write for performance as a lot of contemporary poets do. There's a generational difference. So, but at any rate, poetry does require of you complete attention, quietness, and a kind of subjective study, a study of the words that does not necessarily involve your reason or necessarily involve specific application to the rest of the world. It involves a different kind of application to the world. It requires a certain kind of insight that you can apply, but it is not giving you specific insight in that sense of William Carlos Williams' famous poem about how poetry, how you cannot learn the news from reading a poem, but yet men die every day for lack of it. You know, so yeah, as I think that poetry is and this is basic what we used to call mind expansion back in the day. That poetry and music both offer, poetry and serious music both offer. I mean, your mind can expand and it can find places to settle that it would not be able to settle if you didn't, were not led there by an artist.
Hmm. I love the way you combine adjectives and nouns, which I'll give you an example at the end of Dear John Coltrane, and you said if you, J.C., and Bach ever swap infinite fours, I just think that's marvelous, like infinite fours. And it also begs the question, how did you learn about the terminology that jazz musicians use all the time, the trading of fours and the exchanges and back and forth? Was that by observing, or did someone sort of take you under their wing and talk to you about that?
Well, in New York, I knew a lot of jazz musicians. I knew them very well. I mean, that was a part of my world. The thing about the Lower Manhattan art scene in the 1960s was about as close as America ever got to, say, Montmartre at the turn of the 19th to 20th century, the modernism there. A great concentration of artists of all disciplines living in a relatively small area. They all knew each other. They all hang out together. They went to each other's parties. They drank together. And the exchange was wonderful. And you could, and Lower Manhattan at that time, you could drop in on people like Ornette Coleman or Allen Ginsberg or Larry Rivers, sit down and have a drink and watch them work. And they talk to you, and I'd went by Ornette once, and I remember he said, "Hey, I got this new tune. I think it's going to be really good. I got some problems to work out over here and this part of it. But I think once I get that set up, it's going to be really good. And let me play for you what I've got so far." And it turned out to be Lonely Woman, which I think was one of Ornette's greatest tunes. You go by, I was roommates with a painter named Bob Thompson, who's getting some attention right now. And Bob, he's dead. He's been dead for several years. And he'd be there working. He'd be there working to have his music on. That's one thing. Painters could listen to jazz and work. I always envied from that. They'd have it up really, really loud, and he'd be practically dancing into his canvas, and he'd be talking about it. So, and it's the same with all the musicians. I mean, you'd be playing basketball, pickup basketball game in Tompkins Square Park, and you'd be playing with poets and painters and actors, and it's just a pickup game, but it's also exchange. You see what I'm saying? And then, of course, there are the bars, which we all went to more than we should have. So I knew a lot of jazz musicians. I knew a lot, and once I started writing about it, they would seek me out, and they'd have new records. Can you write my liner notes for me? Can you put me on your radio? I had a radio show on WBAI for a while. Can you play records on the radio show? So I got to know them. So and I would go to their recording sessions sometimes, and so I got to look into the music quite a bit, and got to hear them speak. And so, I learned all this stuff from them. They taught me how to write about music, how to write about them, basically.
Did you ever have an occasion where you wrote about a musician and made some opinions of your own, perhaps some assumptions, and then heard from that musician saying, "I was not thinking that," or "that was not my intention"?
It happened with liner notes all the time, because I'd always show them the notes before I turned them in.
I see.
And they'd make corrections on them. Yes. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think this thing about it's an interesting thing. I'm going to diverge from your question a bit, but it's related. This thing about artists, about poets learning to write about art forms from the artists themselves. I mean, it's a similar kind of thing that came up in, again, going back to, I thought of this when I started talking about Montmartre. I mean, if you look at the early Impressionists, it wasn't the academic critics who wrote about Manet, for example. Baudelaire was Manet's critic. And if you look at the Impressionists, it was always the poets who wrote the reviews, not because the Academy was adamantly opposed to this. It was Apollinaire who wrote about Matisse, and they were great friends. They went out, they chased women together, they got drunk together, and but basically Matisse taught Apollinaire how to write about his art. So I think that is what happened with certainly with Leroy Jones and Mary Baraka and me. We were hanging out with the musicians, and they basically taught us how to write about them. Not formally, but we learned it in conversation and listening when I'm watching them work.
Well, you can't pay for that kind of education.
No, indeed.
Yeah. There were some phrases when you wrote about this is from your first edition intro of your Four Lives in Bebop book, and you were talking about the new jazz in the 60s and that the musicians broke down tonal centers and chord progressions and pat rhythms, any structure they found inhibiting. And I wonder if, in so doing, did the musicians expect that the audience was going to stay with them?
I think they wondered about that. They were concerned about it, but they at this time, you got to bear in mind the time that this was. This was a time of challenge, of breaking institutions, of changing society, and it was expected of a committed artist or a committed activist that one would have to change the people to whom their work was pointed. You had the same thing with Malcolm X, always trying to change minds. Martin King was trying to change the attitude of African American people, as well as the white people who he was challenging about segregation and Jim Crow. So that was an assumption that permeated the work of artists as well. You were trying to change your medium, first of all, and you were trying to change the people who would receive the medium. It was John Coltrane's great commitment to change people with his music. And that's how his music got so hard for many people to hear. It was always easy for me because I had lived through all of its progressions. But for people who had not had that experience, it was often a hard music to hear. But his sense was, if you will sit here and submit to what I'm playing, you will be different and a better person. He was asked what was he trying to accomplish with his music, and he said, "I want to make people saints." And he was serious about that.
This morning I was reading that comment that I just read to you about breaking down tonal centers, and I got this little flash. I said, I remember reading something about a liner note that said something about be advised that this record cannot be loved or understood in one sitting. So I went and got my Ascension LP, and there you were. And you said that this is a guaranteed soul rinsing. So I find it interesting what you just said about John Coltrane and trying to make people saints.
Yeah, you have to submit to art sometimes. I mean, you have to give up all your expectations and basically even your sense of self, and submit to the work itself in order to receive it fully. It's an experience on both ends that is not entirely rational, but largely intuitional. And so it takes a certain kind of discipline to be able to do that. And for people who don't listen to music all the time seriously, then it can be hard to have that experience, to have the music work for you in the way that the musicians intended. But if you can do that, if you can give yourself up to it, and just sort of fly with them, they'll take you somewhere.
Uh-huh. I'm trying to think of an example. We was talking about um, breaking down structures. I'm trying to think of an example of some progressive jazz where they broke down the harmonies and melodically, but the dance oriented groove remained. Because it seems like as people broke down these parts of what we think of as music, that they all were breaking down at the same time. And what we got from that was sometimes free jazz. I'm not sure if I'm verbalizing my question, but can you think of any musicians who sort of kept a dance feel to their music, yet became very explorative with the other parts of it?
Oh yeah, yes, certainly. Like go back to bebop. Dizzy Gillespie was very, very interested in solving the relationship between the dance times of Latin music and the dance times of jazz. And the one is not in the same place. And which was difficult at first for the musicians trying to cross that line. If you listen to the early recordings of the Gillespie Orchestra with Chano Pozo, you will see that they're not always in the same place, certainly at the very beginning. And later on, as it got to Tintin Deo and some of the other tunes, you see they do finally merge. Now, on top of this dance rhythm, there are all these flying bebop lines, but certainly it is this synthesis of different rhythmic patterns from different cultures was a matter that required some serious study and work. And Chano Pozo actually he was an arrogant kind of dude anyway, but he thought he was a superior musician to these Gillespie Orchestra people because he could play in 4/4, but they couldn't play in his rhythm. So, but again, that worked out. I mean, you found some very good musicians who Mario Bowser had originally hired to be in the oh man, my brain is leaking. I have serious brain leak today. This, well,
I should be able to help you out, so I'm having one also.
at any rate, some very great jazz musicians and their early experiences with Latin rhythm really had very great difficulty, finding the one, finding the pulse. And it took a while to work it out. Gillespie sat in for a good year or two with Latin orchestras, so he could be at ease with Latin rhythms. But yeah, I think that these dance rhythms do have like a more of a universal human pulse to them that helps the music get over, and it makes it easier to listen to the melodic lines if you're tapping your foot to the rhythm.
Are you a listener of current jazz recordings?
I really haven't been keeping up lately as much as I should. I get most of the current material off the radio, which means that I don't get to hear the current avant-garde that often. When I do hear it, it sounds like the old avant-garde. It sounds 60 years old to me, which isn't very avant-garde. But yeah, but I don't go out and buy all the new CDs anymore.
Yeah, it's kind of.
I'm giving more attention to poetry now than I am to the music.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Because,
yeah, it's a little stunning to think how many years ago it was that some of this incredible experimentation was going on in jazz.
Well, they tell me that there's great experimentation going on now, but I don't really hear a lot of it. People like VJI, I think, brought some newer stuff to it. It's always interesting how people can come from other cultures and bring those cultures into jazz. It's a great thing about jazz that it can settle almost anywhere and pick up on whatever the rhythms and harmonies and lines of that culture are, and it can work in with the music. I remember just after apartheid fell, and I was at the association, the Arts Education Association, Jazz Education Association, IAJE, International Association of Jazz Education. And I was at the conference, and there was this quartet of young South African musicians, of students from South Africa playing. And at the piano was an Indian fellow who obviously had a great classical background. There was another young Indian fellow playing the tabla, and then there was a Zulu kid playing the bass, and there was a white kid playing the flute, white girl playing the flute, and they made this music. And it was just interesting that at the point at which apartheid fell and all these cultures are now talking to each other in a way that they weren't talking before, that jazz becomes the vocabulary that makes a lot of it possible. I thought that was a very interesting thing to see.
I've often felt that America's greatest export has been its music. If you go around the world, the jazz is in every continent, and of course our rock and roll and hip hop now is pretty much heard everywhere.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that is true. That is true. But on the other hand, we listen to them too. We listen. More people know about gamelan and ragas and African and griot music and such than ever before. So yeah, it's an exchange. Yeah.
Well, let's talk about your poetry for a bit. I wonder, first of all, do you decide as a young man to be a poet?
I decided to be a poet when I was in college.
And is that something from a practical sense that you felt you could make a living at?
No, not at all. I did not think about making a living. I just thought that I wanted to write. I left home, left Elizabeth City, North Carolina in 1952 to go to Howard University to study, be pre-med. The high school I went to in Elizabeth City was really very poor and extremely easy for me. I didn't even take my books home at night, and I was valedictorian. So when I got to college, there I was without a study habit to my name. And I really bombed out in pre-med, because I really did not have any sense about how to be a student. And I was the kind of student who read everything but what he was assigned. I met Leroy Jones, Baraka, when I went there. It was kind of funny. I remember the day I met him. I had just arrived, and I had this outfit that I had shopped all year for to go to Howard, and it was basically a zoot suit, but except it was a sport coat and pants, and the shoulders were out to here. This huge lapel tapered all the way down to the crotch, to a tight-fitting waist. The pants flared out 14 inches at the thigh and 9 inches at the cuff. And it was a blue and white herringbone jacket against a powder blue pair of pants with one dark blue stitch going down the side, which sort of brought the outfit together, and a pair of alligator suede wingtips. And I knew I was sharp. And I got to campus, and everybody's in Brooks Brothers. And it might not have been Brooks Brothers. It might have been, I don't know, J. Crew or whatever, cheaper versions of it are. But I was immediately out of place. And and that's what I was wearing when I met Baraka. And I had this hat. We got to be friends. I don't know why he took me. He was a year ahead of me. I don't know why he took me in, but he did. And I had this hat that I thought was wonderful, but he hated it. And one drunken night, he snatched my hat and ran across campus and threw it in the reservoir. And so, you can't dress like this and hang out with me. Basically, message. So at any rate, so my college years, like everybody's college years, were wonderful and a case of a way of finding myself and growing up. But it soon became apparent to me that I wanted to live a more creative life. I was always attracted to the creative offerings that the school had, the theater group. I joined the theater company and the Howard Players. Had a lead role in He Who Gets Slapped. And it was a time when I'm reading existentialism, and I'm reading Sartre and Camus and Kierkegaard and dying to find people to use it on, And I had this one line where the guy says, "Who are you?" And my line was, "I am he who gets slapped." But I had decided for some weird Kierkegaardian reason that it wasn't he who gets slapped, but it was he who gets slapped. I had very profound explanations for this. I remember Mr. Dawson, the director, said, "No, Spellman, that's not the line. You say, I am he who gets slapped." I said, "No, but you realize that for issues of reification and the self and I started going off. He said, "Look, you're not a theater major. I have many theater majors who'd like to have this part. You can say, I am he who gets slapped, or in about 5 minutes, one of these theater majors is going to have the part." So, but anyway, it was, utterly pretentious, college student. And, but it's even in the course of all that pretension, so you do learn and you do grow and you do think a lot about things.
Mm-hmm.
And, but by my junior year, I was really fully committed to being a poet.
The poetry, did it lead somehow to writing record reviews, or were your record reviews a way to make some income?
Yes, definitely. Let me see. Baraka got me into writing record reviews. He was doing it, and when I moved to New York, he was my closest friend, and he thought I could do it well, and he introduced me to Dan Morgenstern, who was the editor of Metronome magazine at the time. And Dan let me write some more. I wrote the introducing Archie Shepp article on that, and he gave me some records to review. And so that's how I got started in it. I wasn't feeling all that qualified to do it, to tell you the truth. But then when basically the jazz establishment's response to the new music convinced me that I ought to do it, because they had all these articles were coming out about anti-jazz. And John Coltrane was considered to be anti-jazz, as was Cecil and numerous others, Ornette and others. And so I would go to hit this concert, and I'd go to this performance at the Village Gate, say, and I'd hear John Coltrane. He'd be wailing, and I'd leave there really just feeling I just hadn't had the soul rinsing that I mentioned in those liner notes that you referred to, and just practically limp from the experience. And I'd open the magazine and see that John Coltrane was the worst thing that ever happened to jazz, So I'm saying, okay, B, I mean, either you can't hear or they can't hear, and so that's what gave me some confidence to write about it, since that it was being written about, the new music certainly was being written about from a wrong-minded perspective, from people who were not open to it and could not hear what I heard. And I knew I had to trust my own experience, most of all.
That's interesting, because there was a similar thing happening when Bebop and the moldy figs, they called them, that couldn't absorb what was coming out of the instruments at that time.
Yeah, and a lot of these critics who were putting the new jazz of the 60s down had been the defenders of bebop. It's an interesting thing. Ezra Pound, who I don't like to quote, but sometimes do, once said that was referred to as cycle. He said there's a period when everything is set, all the rules are clear, and there's no dissension on it, and the art at those periods is sterile. And then there's a revolution in the form, and you get a lot of new artists, who are taking an entirely different approach to the art, and they break through. And that period is great of discovery, and a lot of great masterpieces are made then. And then that group ossifies into an academy, and the same cycle repeats. Everybody gets to be very conventional again, based on the last revolution. But the great exploration, the great breakthroughs are not occurring anymore. And then a new group of rebels appears. So I think that's true. I think that is true. It certainly was true in jazz.
Years ago, I went, it might have been the same jazz educators gathering that you were at. There was a panel that was entitled Trad Jazz is Alive and Well. And it had some record label people and some players. But on the program for the 3 or 4 days, there was no trad jazz groups that performed. I started thinking about jazz in a larger sense has been elevated to a high art form, and it's in the universities, and it is studied, and you can get PhDs in it. But is New Orleans music and trad jazz in those 20 or 30 years, do you feel that is respected as much as the music from John Coltrane and forward?
I don't think a lot of people listen to New Orleans music anymore, which is too bad, because it's still great music. There was a lot of brilliance in the 1920s and coming forward, and it still speaks, at least to me today. Louis Armstrong, for example, was a voice was a voice for the ages. I mean, I don't think he will ever be obsolete. But still, I think most people know Louis from the singing he did, say during the 1950s to the end of his life, than they do from the times when he was breaking through and establishing himself as the future of music. I mean, there was one Charles, what is his name? One of the great white civil rights lawyers had written about how he grew up in Texas in the world of segregation, and had assumed all of the things that go with sex segregation and Jim Crow, about inferiority and superiority. And then he heard Louis Armstrong play, and he said, "This man is a genius." And he had to face the fact, well, if he's a genius, then all this other stuff can't be true. So it's amazing how music can change so much in a person. But at any rate, I think that the great music is still alive, but the capacity to hear certain great music isn't always there. I mean, I think that I think that people who listen to classical music, a lot of them really can't abide things like motets or the early masses, and that's still great music. So yes, I think for me, the masterpieces remain masterpieces, and you can listen to them at any time.
I had the good fortune to interview the trombone player Benny Powell.
Mm-hmm.
And he said, in his opinion, no great art ever came from happiness, that there had to be adversity for, he said great art to be formed. And I wonder how you feel about that.
I don't think that's true. That's I think one of the myths about art is that you got to be miserable and alienated to make it. That isn't true at all. I've been happy most of my life. Not to name myself a great artist, but I don't find that I made better work when I was depressed and miserable than I did when I was happy. I don't think that's true of other artists as well. I don't have people like Cecil Taylor. He wasn't a miserable person. He was basically in a good mood every time I saw him. Most times that I saw him, at any rate. Coltrane was a quiet guy, but I don't look on him as being a sad and miserable person. So no, I think that that's one of the myths that goes along with things like the blues. You know what I mean? But even the blues is not a miserable form. I mean, most blues songs are quite up, quite joyful.
Yes, Count Basie for sure.
Definitely.
Yeah. With your poetry, at what point do the titles of your poems occur?
Generally after the fact, and sometimes well after the fact. I view titles as like caps, you know. They don't have to look like the rest of the soup, but they do have to be in harmony with it.
I see. That's a terrific analogy. So you're obviously familiar with the tune, Groovin High.
Yes.
And you wrote a poem called Groovin Low.
Oh yeah.
And would you consent to read that for me?
Certainly. Well, whatever Groovin High is about, and I'll make no assumptions, Groovin Low is about getting older. And I do want to say, for anybody who happens to be watching this video, that the weird words in the second stanza are terms of the drum. I mean, I didn't make these words up. Groovin Low. My swing is more mellow these days, not the hard bop drive I used to roll, but more of a cool foxtrot. My eyes still close when the rhythm locks. I've learned to boogie with my feet on the floor. I'm still moving, still grooving, still falling in love. I bop to the bass line now. The trap set, paradiddles, ratomacues, and flams that used to spin me in place still set me off. But I bop to the bass line now. I enter the tune from the bottom up and let trumpet and sax wheel above me. So, don't look for me in the treble. Don't look for me in the fly staccato splatter of the hot young horn. No, you'll find me in the nuance, hanging out in inflection and slur. I'm the one executing the half-bent dip and the slow drag with the smug little smile and the really cool shades.
That's marvelous. Thank you very much. I'm going to use a term you used to describe a Cannonball Adderley solo. It was perfect, not a wrong note.
Thank you. Yeah, well, I revise a lot. I try to be sure that every word is the right word.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of people don't like revision. I think that for poetry, I don't think that I've only known maybe two people in my life who could write a poem without revision, and it would be worthy of publication. And I even thought that those poems would have been improved if they had sat down and gone over and changed a thing here and there.
When you're considering revisions, do you read it aloud?
No, but I hear it.
You hear it, okay.
I hear it, yeah, I definitely hear it, yeah. And I use a lot of iambics. Not because and not as an intentional matter, I don't have any particular brief for iambics, but except that the lines have to scan for me. They have to scan, and they have to swing a little bit. And I think iambics help me do that.
There's a decision you and other poets make regarding uppercase letters. And I'm looking at the poem, and there's no uppercase. And I've wondered in the past, what is is there a reason for that?
I used to have one, and had to involve probably the diminution of the ego and of the and having a more a poetry of equality where everything stood at the same level. I used to have that explanation, but the fact is, I just do it because I've always done it.
Okay.
I try to punctuate with measure. I very seldom use. I punctuate when I can't get out of it. Question marks, for example, I can't find a way around. But usually I try to punctuate at the end of the line on the page would be where the period would be. And I sometimes like to have words bump into each other without commas or semicolons or the like interrupting them. I think that you can find more things in the relationship of the words, I think, without punctuation being there. Not everybody agrees with that approach, but it's fairly common nowadays. I used to be, sort of out there by doing it, but now I see it all the time.
I see. Well, thank you for sharing that with me. I wanted to go back into this. I heard you and Murray Horwitz on the air, a replay of one of the albums you picked for that marvelous jazz review, and it was Cannonball and something else. And on the Autumn Leaves, you called his solo perfect, not a wrong note. And I'm a huge Cannonball fan, so it really caught my attention. And it's been a while, but can you recall why you felt it was perfect?
Why I felt it was perfect. Well, it was Cannonball had a gift for connecting his notes in such a way that everyone seemed like the right note. Now, some other people, like, again, go Coltrane again, would be more like challenging you with the way his notes related to each other. He would create all these tensions within his music and even use things like quarter tones to challenge your ear a bit more. So that the sense of rightness, that this is the correct note, doesn't come into it in the same way that it would with Cannonball. With Coltrane, it was the next note was more of an adventure. With Cannonball, it was more of a validation of everything that had gone before it. And so that was a great gift of Cannonballs. He did this time after time after time. I mean, that everything seemed to flow very, very logically out of everything else. And it made his solos appear more like organic, like little bodies of things. And also, he had just such a beautiful sound and just a perfect casual way of phrasing, playing very difficult passages as if they were just the easiest things in the world to express. I have a great admiration for his music.
Did you know him personally?
Never met Cannonball.
Mm-hmm.
No, never met him.
Yeah. I met Nat.
I did meet him once in Atlanta. I did.
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah.
What is your opinion? This strays off a little bit. When historians look back on our current time in the United States, do you have any idea what they will say about it?
About this time?
Yes, about this time and this
period.
period.
I think they will say that this is the time when fascism took serious hold in the United States. I think that there's a proto-fascism brewing on the right, which is absolutely terrifying. And it is stronger than anything on the left at this particular moment. And the question is, how will all this resolve? I think that there's such a move. I think Donald Trump introduced such a an attitude of authoritarianism and of disregard for institutions or for the laws and rules that had held society together for a while, even with all the contradictions that American society has had within it. And that disregard has taken root in a portion of the country now that makes it all very frightening to me. I think we're in some serious trouble.
I can't disagree. I wonder if you have any thoughts about how we get out of it.
Well, if the some of it I don't have thoughts because a lot of it has to do with the internet, and I never understood that this electronic age in a way that gives me a critique of it that would make any sense to anybody. So that part of it, no. I think that there has to be more of a unity among people who would oppose this rise of fascism, and at least unity on certain principles that this has to be stopped. If not, even if they can't find unity on where society goes afterwards. But I think now the focus should be to stop the rise of this authoritarian right.
Okay, thanks for addressing that. Back to the music for a moment.
Please.
Where does blues fit in the art forms that they're so much a part of American culture? As I said before, you can now get a PhD in jazz studies, but there are no such levels of academia that focus on the blues. Do you know if there's a reason for that?
Well, the fact that I think that jazz musicians have been more aggressive in challenging the institutions to incorporate them, and blues musicians have not had that kind of orientation. They have not basically been academic people, and whereas jazz musicians in the latter part of the 20th century were more academically inclined. And once you started getting and communities demanded it too. Like, for example, the demand for Black studies in the 1960s would lead to the establishment of jazz programs, because that's something that the university could do to address its own mission of African-American cultural development and including African-American history within its curricula. And also there was more of a faculty to be had. So yes, I mean, I think that I very much remember the way it was when I first went to the National Endowment for the Arts in 1977. At that time, jazz was considered to be commercial music, completely unworthy of being addressed by cultural institutions, including universities. It belonged outside of it. It's a large part of jazz's history, as you know, which has always been an outsider history up until, again, this current age. So that once you started getting jazz programs established, some of the early programs like the one in North Texas State, which developed a really good jazz orchestra, didn't have many Black people in it, but it did at least recognize the music and showed that you could have a serious academic curriculum involved that could develop the music. Once that momentum started, then of course it spread to where every conservatory has to have some kind of a jazz program. Now, it hasn't been altogether a great thing, Because again, something gets lost when you make these big social based transformations in the music. We now have more this generation of jazz musicians, which is has more technique, knows more theory and more history than any other, and yet it's almost can't tell them apart. The products of these things. So something gets lost when you have to make these discoveries of the instrument on your own without being told how to play it by a professor. Maybe an older musician on the instrument will give you some tips every now and then, but basically you have to find it yourself. But in so doing, you do develop a voice and you do develop a sound. So the generations of musicians where you'd hear a phrase of Ben Webster and know it's Ben Webster, you know what I mean? That is gone. Also, I find it odd that with all these musicians, again, more technically adept, more theoretically sound than any other generation, we haven't had an overriding genius appear since John Coltrane. And he died in 1967. That's 55 years ago. Coltrane and Charlie Parker overlapped. You know, Louis Armstrong and Charlie Parker overlapped. You know, Art Tatum overlapped with the bebop musicians. So it's in a strange place, Jazz. I don't really understand where it goes and how it goes. But maybe
how do you define genius? I remember talking to Phil Woods, who very honestly made the assessment of himself that he was a craftsman, not an innovator. And I wonder if, well, get back to my original question. Do you have a definition for yourself of a genius in any field?
Well, it's my definition. It won't conform with the dictionary's definition. But a genius is a person, to me, is a person who makes his or her medium different from the way it was before them. You see, and I think a lot of the genius may have gone out of jazz when it became more bourgeois. I mean, that ghetto genius that produced Charlie Parker, you know, and Bud Powell and Thelonious Monk, now got lost to hip hop because we took the instruments away from the kids. So they made a music out of words. If that genius had gone into jazz, we would have a different jazz, you see. But I don't know what to do about it. I mean, definitely more. I'm for all kinds of training programs and communities of people who are without resources. I'm for all of that. But I don't know how we get that back.
Mm-hmm. This is, I'm not sure we can get into this subject at this point. I'll just throw it out that white musicians oftentimes seem to have more success with a certain style that was created by African American musicians. Do you think Cecil Taylor was observing the success of people like Dave Brubeck and feeling the unfairness of it?
Yes, yes, he talked about things like that. He did feel that way, that it was very unfair. I mean, he didn't blame Brubeck for it, but he felt like the society will accept, at least the society of people with resources, basically white people, would accept white musicians playing the music over black musicians. And that's true. You can see that in popular music very, very easily. You know, Elvis, whom I did not consider to be a very talented person. I mean, I didn't like the way he sang. I thought he was a very awkward dancer. But nonetheless, there was Elvis, you know what I mean? How many black musicians were more talented than Elvis? Jerry Lee Lewis, I had some respect for. If I pick a Memphis white boy, I'll take him. But it is that. It is that sense. The Beatles, Beatles covers, the early Beatles covers of soul music recordings, and Rolling Stones. Time is on my side. Much better song on Wilson Pickett, but much bigger song. When it's sung from Britain.
I see. Well, I have enjoyed this conversation so much, and I'll do something that interviewers really aren't supposed to do, but I'll do it anyway. Is there anything that you'd like to talk about that I haven't asked you?
Let me think. No, I'm pretty much talked out. Boy, I'm getting a little hoarse in the throat now.
Okay.
I can't talk as long as I used to. I can't do it as long as I used to.
Yeah. Well, I'm going to paraphrase something you wrote in your introduction to your Four Lives in Bebop. Yes, and I'm paraphrasing for this occasion, and I'll say, I hope I have not put any words in your mouth. You have enough marvelous words of your own.
Thank you a lot, Monk. I enjoyed talking to you.